There aren't many names in American mythology that shine with as much holiness as Oregon Trail. From the middle to the end of the 1800s, the historic road, which went over 2,000 miles from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, gave people who were willing to make the difficult journey a chance to start over. So many people had been waiting for this chance to come along. There was gold in California, free land in Oregon, and the chance to get away from the political unrest and economic downturns in the East. There were a lot of good reasons to move westward. After all these years, it's easy to see why the Oregon Trail has become such an idealized part of American history. Many Hollywood movies and TV shows have been way off when they try to show the Old West over the years. The famous video game, The Oregon Trail, wasn't exactly the best education either. In general, the Oregon Trail did represent a time of change in American history. There are some hidden facts about the 2,000-mile hike that need to be talked about, though. The Oregon Trail was a piece of a larger puzzle. A family's journey along the Oregon Trail didn't always mean that they were going to Oregon in the end. People going west had a list of great places in mind. There was a story that California was full of gold, and by 1848, thousands of Americans were going toward the soon-to-be state in hopes of getting rich. People who wanted to go to California would only take the Oregon Trail as far as Idaho. After that, they would have to deal with Nevada's hot sands and difficult mountains. A lot of Mormons who were running away from religious oppression also used the Oregon Trail, but they didn't start until they got to Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Pioneer Mormons often chose to stay north of the Platte River to stay out of trouble with non-Mormon visitors and avoid competition. They would start their journey at Fort Laramie and follow the Oregon Trail for almost 400 miles. The last 116 miles of their trip would be through terrible mountain terrain that led to Utah. The Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, among others, were all part of a bigger network of migration routes that linked up to make more manageable ways to get to the West. It was about more than just Oregon. Despite popular belief, the Oregon Trail was not a battleground. When you think of the Oregon Trail, you might picture a violent time when people were constantly at odds with any Native American group they came across. Yes, horrible events like the Unter Van Ornum Party massacre, in which 25 residents were killed, did happen, but history shows that fighting between the two groups was less common than you might think. Over the course of the Oregon Trail, traders and Native Americans were more likely to do business with each other than to fight. Indian groups mostly didn't bother wagon trains in the early days of the Oregon Trail, when people were moving west to the Pacific Northwest. Even though fighting got worse after the Civil War started, the numbers don't show that there was constant violence. Native American groups killed about 362 Americans who were leaving their homes between 1840 and 1860, while newcomers on the Oregon Trail killed about 426 Native Americans. The thousands of people traveling west on the Oregon Trail were statistically much more likely to be killed by a random attack from a nearby Native American group. It was thought for many years that the worst enemies on the road were the ones that couldn't be seen. Disease was a major Oregon Trail threat. Even though dysentery is a joke now, it was anything but that for people who were moving west. Travelers on the Oregon Trail were constantly getting sick, and settlers also had to deal with a never-ending stream of cruel illnesses. Diseases like measles, flu, scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, smallpox, cholera, which was the most deadly on the Oregon Trail. And yes, dysentery followed travelers all the way across the 2,000-mile stretch to the west. There wasn't enough clean water, people were generally tired, and there wasn't any sanitation on the road, so these diseases were certain to spread. The National Park Service thinks that about 30,000 people walking the Oregon Trail died of disease. On top of all that, the medicine that pioneers had access to was, well, more focused on treating symptoms than reasons, to put it mildly. Those who were forced to leave their homes could turn to whiskey, rum, vinegar, castor and peppermint oils, turpentine, and big amounts of opium for help if they got sick with diseases like dysentery and cholera. Wagon crushings and other fatal accidents often occurred on the Oregon Trail. As if the many dangerous diseases weren't enough to worry about, Pioneers on the Oregon Trail also had to watch out for many accidents that could kill them. Many deaths that could have been avoided happened because people were tired from long trips and were just careless. On the Oregon Trail, for example, people were often killed by sudden, unintentional gunfire. If someone got their hands on the wrong gun, it could kill people on a wagon train just as easily as getting sick. It was also very likely that they would drown while trying to cross a rough river. Being crushed by a moving wagon was another very common and scary way to die. This was especially true for kids. Some accounts of history describe tragic events where a child's badly hurt and infected limb had to be cut off without any general anesthesia. But the child did not live. From falling down a rocky slope and dying to children being crushed by wagons or taking the whole vial of their parents' opium medicine, the number of records about travelers dying horribly or by accident on the way west is truly amazing. Enslavement and racism were alive and well on the Oregon Trail. From 1841 on, at least 300,000 people made their way along the Oregon Trail. White pioneers who were moving westward were given strength by the growing belief in manifest destiny, which is the idea that expanding the United States across the continent was God's will for the country. However, this optimism was not meant for black pioneers, whether they were free or not. Slaves had to follow the families they worked for across the Oregon Trail, even if they didn't want to. In the region, African Americans, both free and slave, were in a nightmare situation. In 1844, Oregon made it illegal to own slaves and gave slave owners 3 years to free their slaves. They also passed a set of laws that made it illegal for black people to live in Oregon. 15 years later, this meant that slaves like Rose Jackson, who asked her owners to let her move to the territory with them, had to make most of the trip across the Oregon Trail in a box with holes in it. In 1844, George Washington Bush, an African American from Missouri who was free and had served in the War of 1812, traveled the Oregon Trail with his Irish wife and 5 children. When they got to Oregon, they found that there was a new harsh law called the Lash Law that said any black person who stayed in Oregon would get at least 20 lashings. This made Bush take his group north of the Columbia River, where he could find his own land to settle, even though there were many unfair laws all around him. The Oregon Trail birthed its own strange economy. It's only natural that the Oregon Trail created its own strange economy, since so many people packed up a lot of stuff and traveled for thousands of miles. To put things in perspective, the average family that went west probably brought between 200 and 600 pounds of flour, 150 to 400 pounds of bacon, a lot of sugar, lard, coffee, and many other things they would need. Pioneer towns like Independence, Missouri, and Council Bluffs, Iowa, had a great time with all the pioneer families. In order to get as many people as possible to visit their town, rival towns would send agents to the east to say bad things about each other. As soon as settlers got to a frontier town, traders jumped on them and told families they needed everything. Some things don't change. For example, people today often bring too much for a weekend road trip, and farmers in the 1800s often thought they could carry more than they actually could. How to solve it? Start getting rid of things. For people looking for food, this turned out to be a gold mine. All they had to do was wait for a wagon train to leave a starting place like Independence and quickly follow. They would probably find a cast iron stove or food boxes waiting for them. Leaving food and water behind was a sad thing that happened a lot on the Oregon Trail. Almost everywhere a wagon train went, it left behind a trail of trashed goods and supplies. The Oregon Trail created a market for bad trail guides. Going the wrong way on a western trail in the 1800s could mean death. Today, missing an exit or making the wrong turn is annoying. Additionally, pioneers in the 1800s were unhappy because there were many guidebooks ready to give them wrong information. As the United States moved west, the market for trail guides grew and made money. As soon as people heard about all the gold in California in early 1848, a huge number of guides were made very quickly. Of course, most of them were bad. They were happy to use flowery language to describe their possible destinations, but when it came to giving real advice on how to get there, they either didn't give any or gave wrong information. Pioneers would read that there would be no water in a certain place, but when they got there, they found a fresh spring. People who followed the dangerous works of Lansford Hastings, the author of The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, ended up in the tragedy of the Donner Party, an expedition that ended in death and cannibalism. Most people had to walk, not ride, on the Oregon Trail. When you think of the Oregon Trail, you probably picture strong animals and wagons trundling through endless meadows, dirt roads, and rocky mountain scenery. This is a natural association, since both were essential for people traveling west. That being said, most passengers didn't have the freedom to get on or off the wagon or horse whenever they wanted. The main way that many people on the Oregon Trail got around, especially kids, was by walking, a lot of walking. In other words, a family wagon could hold as much stuff as possible. It wouldn't have been fun to ride in the wagon anyway. The roads out west weren't very well maintained, and being squished inside a box on wheels without any stabilization sounds like a terrible nightmare. In general, a wagon train had a good day when it went at least 18 miles. For people traveling the Oregon Trail, the day began around 4 a.m. and finished around 5 p.m., which meant they had to walk for several hours every day on rough terrain, while probably wearing shoes that weren't built for walking. An immigrant had to walk non-stop on the Oregon Trail for 2,000 miles and several months. Add diarrhea and a party member who was accidentally shot to this already difficult situation, and you have a truly awful time. On the Oregon Trail, women were expected to pull double duty. In the 1800s, married women didn't make choices about the future of their home. If their husband wanted to uproot their family and make the 2,000-mile trip across the Oregon Trail, that was the end of it. It was 1850 when Margaret Hereford Wilson told her mother, "I am going with him because there is no other choice." Women had hard lives on the road, just like everyone else, but maybe even harder because they had to do extra work. She had to make the food for the day, even when she didn't have much to work with. If her husband or any of the other men in the wagon train got sick, they had to take over guard duty. Also, it wasn't unusual for women to do other manly jobs, like driving the wagon and taking care of the animals. Men were much more likely to be afraid and careful about doing anything by mistake that was usually done by women, even on the Oregon Trail. In fact, just the act of a husband getting water for the day's cleaning could get the attention of the camp. As one rather hilarious and sad account reads, "When the first Saturday came round, I prepared to do some of my family laundry work. My husband carried water, filled the wash boiler, and placed it over the open fire for me. Mrs. Norton was a deeply interested spectator and remarked rather sadly, 'The Yankee men are so good to their wives, they help them so much,' per end of the Oregon Trail Interpretive Center. Women on the Oregon Trail were the true hidden heroes. They took care of camp, watched kids, and did any other job that was asked of them. Conestoga wagon was not used much on Oregon Trail. When you say Oregon Trail, most people will immediately think of a huge wagon, especially the huge Conestoga wagon. Over the years, the car has come to represent the tough pioneer spirit that was a big part of the American westward growth era. Surprisingly, the Conestoga wagon wasn't used by people crossing the Oregon Trail very often because it was too heavy. Instead, people from the eastern United States relied on it more often. The wagon was 26 feet long and 11 inches wide. It weighed between 3,000 and 3,500 pounds when it wasn't loaded, and it usually took more than 5 horses to pull it properly. Oxen that were very strong could die if they pulled the Conestoga wagon for too long. Also, the wagon did best when it was moving along roads that were in good shape. It would be terrible for something so heavy to travel through natural terrain that was uncertain and bumpy, like that found in the Great Plains. The prairie schooner is the kind of gear that should be the face of the Oregon Trail. This wagon was about half the size of the Conestoga and weighed about 1,300 pounds when it wasn't loaded. It was much easier for a group of 4 to 6 horses or 6 to 10 mules to pull. Also, the prairie schooner had 2 smaller front wheels that let the driver make faster turns. It could also be taken apart to fix problems. On the whole, The prairie schooner was the best and only choice for making one's life better and choosing that one wagon to take out west. The rise of railroads made the Oregon Trail obsolete. As the United States tried to heal from the many scars left by the Civil War during the harsh and slow Reconstruction era, which began in May 1869, one of its most important infrastructure projects was finished: the first transcontinental railroad. The first railroad ran from Sacramento, California to Omaha, Nebraska. It was built with the dangerous and unsung work of 12,000 Chinese immigrants. This was the first time in U.S. history that the East and West really met. This huge step forward in technology helped the United States start a new, uncharted part of its past. And since more train lines were on the way, this meant that the Oregon Trail would slowly end. Pioneers may have needed 6 months to get where they were going, but now people could get there in just a few days. Back in the 1880s, immigrants still often walked the trail with their wagon teams because not everyone could afford this new way to travel. But soon, seeing endless rows of wagon trains pulled by oxen became a sign of a bygone era and an image that will always be linked to American lore. We hope you liked this video, subscribe to the channel if you're a history addict, and please let us know about what civilization or time period we should talk about. Also, watch another video here.